course of the election campaign, we're hoping to bring you debates between ministers and their shadows in some of the key portfolios. Tonight, we're starting with immigration, in particular asylum seeker policy. The major parties are in a bitter dispute over their plans, even though they're broadly in agreement on the foundations, offshore processing and mandatory detention. A short time ago, I was joined in the Sydney studio by the Immigration Minister Tony Burke and his shadow Scott Morrison. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Good to hear.
We know that both your parties support offshore processing, Nauru and PNG as partners in that, mandatory detention, a regional solution involving our neighbours, particularly Indonesia, a humanitarian refugee intake, the use of Navy and Customs to respond to boats. Given all that common ground, what do each of you consider to be the single biggest point of difference in your policy approach? Tony Burke.
My focus is on implementation, and I think it's fair to say the greatest frustration that I've found have been the attempts from the opposition to claim that the arrangements with Papua New Guinea will not be appropriately implemented. The entire policy and framework depends on the extent to which people will test our resolve, because that determines how many people end up being affected by it. Now, we will have whatever capacity is required, but the more there is a discussion here implying that we won't implement it, the more people will put their lives at risk at the high seas.
Well, you're not actually answering my question. What is the single biggest point of difference between your policies?
Well, in terms of approach, that's a massive difference in approach. In terms of policy terms, I think in terms of the number of people who we actually want to be able to help in from around the world, we've got a figure at the moment of 20,000, which is the figure for the government. Scott Morrison's argument is that should go down. Ours is that should go up.
OK, so Tony Burke nominates the humanitarian intake. What do you consider to be the single biggest point of difference?
Our focus has always been on deterrence first. Now, that obviously includes turning boats back where it's safe to do so, but it's a deterrence model that goes all the way up the chain and bringing all of that for implementation purposes under a single command, and making sure that you have the ability to respond to issues as they arise, because this is a daily struggle. The other key difference is form. Our form is we've got this done before. Our record shows that we have, and the proven resolve and commitment and consistency. We've always believed in these policies. The government has had every point in the compass on this debate.
Tony Burke, is this a fair point? Because he points out that the Coalition has consistently supported things like offshore processing, but you're a recent convert to that.
I think it's fair to say that from about 2005 on, both sides of politics were paring back on the 2001 settings. From 2009 on, you had a change around the world, and both sides of politics needed to toughen their measures. We were too late to do that.
He's raised consistency, though.
Well, in terms of consistency, I'm saying they were doing the same as us in the final term of John Howard. Scott will argue that Petro Georgiou never existed. Scott will argue that the 2001 settings remained in place until we came there.
Scott Morrison, were you trying to wind them back?
No, we in fact brought an excision bill for the Australian mainland into the Parliament, and the Labor Party opposed it. The only change we made was to bring children out of held detention. Now, there were just over 50 people who were children in held detention at that time, and we successfully did that. Now, the big difference between us and the government is, I have no doubt about the Minister's earnest intention to get children out of held detention. His predecessor, once removed, held the same intention, but he failed miserably because boats kept turning up with children on them. And so, no, we weren't winding it back. It was the Labor Party and Kevin Rudd who got rid of the border protection measures that worked under John Howard, and 50,000 people have turned up since at a cost of $9 billion.
That is accurate, isn't it, Tony? You changed the policies and 50,000 people turned up.
Factually inaccurate what he said about the final term of the Howard government. I don't want to spend the whole night on the history, but I can't let Scott get away with claiming that children out of detention was the only thing that happened in that final term. The vast majority of people on temporary protection visas who were told they'd never be given permanent visas were given them. All but two of the people who were on Nauru, who'd been told they would never be settled in Australia, were settled in Australia. To claim that those things never happened is just dishonest.
Let's talk about what's happening now. Tony Burke, can you give us the latest information on what's happened with the pattern of boat arrivals to Australia since you introduced your so-called PNG solution? Look,
there's been a tapering down, which doesn't fully reflect what's changing on the ground in Indonesia. So, from the perspective of people smugglers, they have an incentive to try to fill their boats. What's happening is many of the people who had come to Indonesia with the intention of paying people smugglers are now either refusing to get on, and some are actually either registering with the UNHCR or heading home. The
And can
pool
you give
of
us
people
numbers on this?
Well, effectively what you've got is you can, if you go back over, say, the last 7 days or something like that, to the first 7 days of the policy, you find a significant tapering down. Now, depending on how many days you go, you'll get a different percentage, between 40% or 20%. But it only tells part of the story because you've effectively got backfilling. People who would have got on boats had the policy not been in place, not getting on at all and refusing to get on, while people smugglers offering cut price deals, desperately trying to backfill. They are steadily running out of the number of customers because the product has been taken from them.
Is this the intelligence you're hearing, Scott Morrison?
Well, the government has access to the intelligence.
Now, Julie Bishop's been briefed.
And she got a confidential briefing, which you'd expect her to keep confidential. But the government will claim all sorts of things between here and the election, but I'm going to take them to what Kevin Rudd said, and that the announcement effect of this, you won't know for several months. We won't know the real effect of all of this until down the track. What will be the test of this is what happens on the other side of the election. And so who will be able to follow through on the other side of the election? Who is really committed to these policies? Who has the broad sweep of policies that will make the difference and that is proven? And that's the judgment people have to make at this election. I mean, the government's got the big election fix. We had one last time. It was called East Timor. We've had a whole bunch of others. What we know down the track with Labor is it always unravels because in their heart they really don't believe it.
Scott Morrison, if you're elected, you've said that you'll use a 3-star general to run your response.
A military officer, yes.
So clearly you think that this is a national security issue because you're involving the military like that. What exactly do you see as the threat to Australia's national security?
What the military bring to this is the ability to get 15 different agencies working together. That's the management and leadership skill that they bring. Because what I have observed after watching policy and initiative after initiative fail under Labor is that Tony has his hands on effectively one set of levers, the immigration levers. What our policy Operation Sovereign Borders is about is bringing agencies together from our intelligence agencies, our customs agencies, our federal police, our immigration, and those within the Defence through Border Protection Command to work under a single command.
Let's address what I asked. Do you see a threat to Australian national security, and what is that threat?
Well, there's always been a threat when people are coming illegally to Australia. Now, I've never overstated that threat, but the premise of bringing the military into this is to bring their leadership and management skill to get a mission accomplished. And that's what we want to see here. And we think someone at 3-star level, from whatever of the services they come from, can bring that coordination, that response capacity, so we can deal with this issue from day to day.
Scott Morrison, you've said that you will turn back the boats where it's safe to do so. Many naval types have warned that you can do that, but that it is risky and it's dangerous. Is the risk to our naval personnel and to customs people and to people on the actual boats greater than the risk to Australia of letting those people land here?
Well, currently these serving people in our defence forces and our customs agencies are out there taking bodies out of the water. They're out there running a taxi service, and those I've spoken to are very keen to get out there and do the job and protect Australia's borders. That's why it's called Border Protection Command, and at the moment that's not what it's doing. It's taking people as a ferry service to Christmas Island and other places. Now, we know it's a difficult job, but we have great faith in our Navy, we have great faith in our customs officers, and Admiral Ritchie, Brigadier Hogan and General Molan have all indicated and said very clearly that this can be done. So it's one of the many things you have to do, Lee. It's not the single thing, it's one of the many things. And with Operation Sovereign Borders, it brings that together with immigration, together with intelligence, together with the Australian Federal Police. Now, the government doesn't have such a model.
Tony Burke,
they're one out.
You'd write a reply?
In terms of turning back the boats, you can't take the policy settings that were used in 2001, photocopy them, and think that in the intervening years, people smugglers haven't learnt anything. The boats now come ready for sabotage, and the moment you get the point of interception, they are very quick to turn it into a safety of life at sea operation. Now, Scott's previously said, and I believe him, that no matter who's in power in Australia, we're not the sort of nation that will leave people drowning in the ocean. That means that you're not going to turn boats around, because the moment it turns into a safety of life at sea operation, you're getting people on board.
But
to pretend otherwise presumes that people smugglers will forget everything that they've learnt in the last decade.
But tell me, Tony, what happens in that safety of life at sea situation? It's in the Indonesian search and rescue zone. Indonesia has the responsibility to provide the safe place for those who are on that vessel. That's the search and rescue protocol. Now, I know that's outside of your portfolio. Under our system, it would be within my portfolio, and we'd be able to work all of these issues together to get the right outcome. That's why we have Operation Sovereign Borders.
Tony Burke.
You're right. You do need to update things, and that's how we've updated
Response?
it.
I don't believe, and I don't want to be misrepresenting Scott here, but I don't believe for a minute that if they got the same call from Indonesia saying your vessel is closer than ours, can you please go to a vessel in distress, that they would refuse to do so.
But that doesn't change the situation, Tony. I don't know if you're familiar with those procedures, but in that exact same situation, Indonesia remains the place under that convention to provide the safe place.
Is that your understanding, Tony Burke?
My understanding of all of this is the game changer that meant whether or not a boat could be turned around. And Scott's now shifted from whether or not you're physically turning a boat around. The change as to whether you could turn a boat around was the moment they worked out, turn it into a safety of life at sea operation.
Okay.
People smugglers give the people on board two instructions. One, here's a mobile phone and when to use it. And two, when you see the vessel, start to sink.
But the government's response here is to just to surrender on this issue and not try that option. It's part of our plan and we will.
No, our response is to make sure people are not settled in Australia, and you know that.
Gentlemen, I started this interview by pointing out the broad areas that you have in common in terms of your approach to this area. Given all of that common ground, doesn't the Australian public have a right to expect that you should be able to find a way to work together to deal with this very difficult policy area?
Well, I think there have been areas where the government has finally relented. Offshore processing, they had to be dragged kicking and screaming to doing. I can't agree that they've implemented it terribly well. I mean, one of the centres burnt to the ground. But that said, I think there are difficult decisions in this space which Tony makes as a minister, and if I were to be a minister, there are difficult moral burdens that attach to that.
Why do you make it so difficult for each other with the
Well, we have a
constant
difference of view, Lee, about some critical points about turning boats back and things of that nature. The government doesn't agree. That's their right. The Australian people can decide on September 7.
Tony Burke, can you understand that the public's frustrated that you seem to have a lot of common ground, yet there's always this magnification of your areas of difference?
Absolutely. It's the reason why at media conferences now I generally don't respond to what Scott said in his previous media conference, and I just give a report on implementation.
I heard your media conference today and you talked a lot about what the opposition had said.
I've referred specifically to the challenges that have been made because I thought they'd said some very dangerous things about the Torres Strait in terms of trying to create an impression that somehow the gateway is open there. Let's not forget, it's not only Australians who hear what we say in public. If you start to declare that there's a pathway that's open and free and available for people smuggling, that is heard across the globe. Now, there's a heavy responsibility there. When they say something like that, I do take the point of making sure that it's corrected. It's a responsible thing to make sure that's corrected. We had a moment in time where it looked like the sort of bipartisanship you described was going to be there, and it was immediately after the PNG arrangement had been signed. We had a media conference where they were indicating a level of support. It lasted about 24 hours.
Well, we've got to look at the details, Lee, and that's the issue. The government doesn't want to be held to account on these things. When I said the asylum freeze, which Kevin Rudd would put in place, would lead to tension centres getting burnt down, they criticised me. I proved to be right. When I said the East Timor solution was an election stunt, it proved to be right. When I said the Malaysian people swap would fall foul of the Migration Act, they said I was being negative. The High Court proved me right. I've seen the holes, they've always ignored them, and it always ends in ruin.
A brief right of reply before we finish.
This is being implemented. We had another plane load this morning, a plane load the day before. People are being transferred to Papua New Guinea. They realise they won't be settled in Australia. We have taken the product away from people smugglers. That gives us an opportunity now to stop the drownings at sea and to actually have a humanitarian program that could increase over time, and we negotiate with the United Nations, not self-selected by people smugglers.
Tony Burke, Scott Morrison, thank you very much.
Thanks,
Be with you.
Thanks, Dave.
In a sensational climax